Their lives were determined by cycles, not calendar cycles, but natural ones. Summer was a time of hard work, autumn was harvest time, and winter was a time of survival. The castles we see on postcards today were not so much luxurious dwellings as harsh fortresses against enemies in the cold. The people who lived in them were not idle lords and ladies sitting by the fireplace. Their existence was a constant struggle for warmth, food, and ultimately, life. The interior rooms were cold, drafts were the norm, and windows, if they existed at all, were covered not with glass but with thin oiled leather. They lived in conditions that modern people cannot even imagine. No electricity, no central heating, no thermos flasks or down jackets. They had no choice but to adapt. Their survival techniques, their ingenuity, and their resilience were the result of a daily struggle. These were people who didn't just live, they survived every day. They learned to make the most of the least, to use every resource to the last crumb. Watch until the end, and you'll find out why their winter diet was more thoughtful than ours, and why every log they saved was more important than hundreds of dollars in our bank accounts. Winter in the Middle Ages did not arrive suddenly, as if at the snap of a finger, but crept up gradually, giving time to prepare. Its harbingers were short, cloudy days and piercing cold winds that made you shiver with every breath. Long before the first snow, when the ground had not yet frozen, everyone who was strong enough to hold an axe set off for the nearby forest. Firewood gathering was not just a duty or a routine, but a sacred, vital ritual on which the survival of the entire community depended. It was painstaking and exhausting work that began long before the onset of cold weather and required enormous effort. Every year, so much wood was needed that it is difficult for modern people to imagine. The quantities were enormous. Even a small castle, let alone a large one, consumed tons of wood, which meant that work had to be done incessantly. These were not just piles of logs that were thrown down haphazardly, but carefully selected, chopped, dried, and carefully stacked logs. The entire process took many months, starting in early spring, when it was easier to chop, and continuing until late autumn, when it had to be finished before the first frost turned the ground to stone. In summer, when the days were long and hot, the logs were chopped, cleaned of branches and bark, and then split into logs. It was extremely hard physical work, involving not only adult men, but also women and even children, who helped carry branches and smaller logs. They worked from dawn to dusk without days off or breaks because they knew that every extra log meant an extra day of warmth, and every extra day of warmth meant a life saved from the cold. The wood was not all the same, and each type of tree had its own characteristics. Oak and beech, being hardwoods, gave off a lot of heat and burned for a long time, smoldering slowly, but they were difficult to chop, then split and carry over long distances. Spruce and pine burned quickly, with crackling and sparks, but gave off a lot of resin and soot, which settled on the walls and in the respiratory tract, causing constant coughing and other health problems. An experienced woodcutter knew which species were best suited for the main hearth and which were best for kindling, such as small branches and birch bark, which would flare up from a single spark. They worked all day long, and often longer, until the first frost began and the ground froze. The felled trees were dried under shelters to prevent rot and mold and to preserve maximum energy. Improperly dried wood could ruin the entire winter, giving off little heat and filling the room with smoke. It was a kind of economy where the main commodity was not bread, but firewood, and their quality determined the very existence of the community. When the wood was ready, it was carefully stored. Wood piles were carefully planned and organized to ensure maximum preservation. The logs were stacked so that there was a gap between them for air to circulate, allowing the wood to breathe. This helped keep the wood dry, prevent it from rotting, and make it completely ready for use. Sometimes firewood was even stored inside the castle, in special utility rooms, so that it was always close at hand and did not get damp from snow and moisture. Their life was an endless cycle of planning and preparation, where everything was subordinated to one goal: survival. They knew that the slightest mistake in summer would result in hunger and cold in winter, which could be fatal. The wood stores were always kept in strict order and discipline. The logs were stacked in neat rows, forming tall, stable walls that were difficult to destroy. Sometimes the most valuable dry wood, intended for heating the master's quarters, was stored separately under lock and key. This supply was sacred, and only trusted people had access to it. Preparing firewood was not just physical labor, but also a complex logistical task requiring strategic thinking and careful calculation. People had to not only chop the wood, but also store it properly so that it would not spoil and retain all its qualities. It was a constant battle with nature, where every detail was crucial for survival. It was not just about accumulating resources, but about managing life, and every little thing mattered. What do you think would be more difficult? Earning money to heat your home for the whole winter, or like them, cutting tons of firewood yourself? Leave your opinion. The castle's stone walls, thick and massive, were excellent protection against external enemies, repelling attacks, but poor protection against the cold. Stone conducted cold perfectly, and the interior rooms were frozen through, even when it wasn't that cold outside. The only source of heat was a fireplace, which was lit in the main hall or in the master's quarters. The hearth could not heat the entire castle, only a small part of it, and the heat quickly dissipated. People gathered in one or more rooms where there was a fire to escape the cold. These were large halls, sometimes even kitchens, where they could warm themselves by the fire while food was being prepared and water was boiling. But fire was only part of the solution, and drafts were the main cause of all the trouble. Cold air penetrated through cracks in the walls, under doors, and through small windows, which were often covered not with glass, but with oiled leather or wooden shutters, which did not provide complete insulation. To combat this in any way possible, people used everything at hand that could serve as some kind of barrier. Fabric curtains, massive tapestries, and carpets were hung on the walls to insulate the room from the frozen stones. They not only added warmth, but were also a symbol of status, showing the wealth and position of the owner. The richer the castle, the more tapestries there were, which served not only as decoration, but also as a kind of insulation for the walls. At the same time, they had a purely practical purpose. They created an additional layer that trapped heat and prevented it from escaping. Beds also played their part in the fight for warmth. They were often raised on a platform so that the cold air that descended would not cool the sleepers so much. In addition, there was a canopy made of thick fabric above them. This canopy was not a decorative element, but a kind of tent inside the room, creating its own microclimate. It helped to retain the heat that a person generated during the night, preventing it from escaping. Thus, a person slept in a kind of mini house inside a huge, cold room. Sometimes beds were even placed near the hearth to get the maximum amount of heat, but this was not available to everyone. The floors were also insulated. They were covered with a thick layer of straw, which not only served as insulation from the icy stone, but also collected dirt, making cleaning easier since it was easier to replace the straw than to wash the floor. Finally, the walls were plastered with clay and moss to seal even the smallest cracks through which the icy air could penetrate. Every scrap of fabric, every layer of straw, every grain of clay, all of this was part of one big strategy aimed at preserving the heat without which life was impossible. But what to do when all these tricks didn't help and the cold penetrated to the bone? When survival depended not on the amount of firewood, but on the willingness to sacrifice what was dearer than life itself for warmth? Keep watching to find out. Medieval castles were a kind of microcosm where every resource was of great importance and use to the last. Their survival was based entirely on the principle of zero waste, where nothing was wasted. Managing these resources was a real art that required skill, wisdom, and foresight to ensure survival. No material was thrown away, as everything had its price, its purpose, and could be useful in the household. This was not only true for obvious things such as food and fuel, but also for the most unexpected items that modern people would not even consider a resource. Take straw, for example. Straw, which we now consider a byproduct and sometimes even rubbish, was then a valuable and multifunctional material. It was a symbol of practicality and resourcefulness, and its use was widespread. It was used as bedding for livestock to prevent animals from freezing on the icy floor of the barn, which was critical for their health. This helped keep livestock healthy, prevent colds, and maintain productivity. Straw was also used as insulation for walls, which was stuffed into cracks and gaps, and for floors which were covered with a thick layer. This simple and affordable material created an incredibly important insulating barrier, preventing the cold from entering the room. This not only insulated the room from the cold, but also created at least some minimal comfort. Straw floors also muffled sounds and created a quieter, more pleasant atmosphere in the castle. Most importantly, it was used to make mattresses and bedding, which were much warmer than sleeping on a cold stone slab. These mattresses, filled with dry straw, were the main sleeping place for most of the castle's inhabitants, from servants to knights. Another important resource was wool. Wool sheared from sheep was used for clothing, warm blankets, which were the basis of the sleeping place, and even for insulating windows. These thick woolen fabrics were indispensable for protection against the bitter cold. When there was not enough wool, leather and fur were used for warmth, which were taken from slaughtered animals. This was very expensive and prestigious, but it saved people from frostbite, as fur created a windproof barrier. Even bird feathers collected during hunting or after slaughter were put to good use. They were used to make duvets and pillows, which, like straw, helped to retain heat by creating an air layer. These feather products were soft and cozy, allowing the body to relax and not waste energy on tension. In addition, people used charcoal, which was obtained from wood by slowly burning it in special pits dug in the ground. Charcoal burned longer and gave off more heat than ordinary firewood, while producing less smoke and soot. It was a real luxury and highly valued, used to heat small rooms such as smithies, where high and constant temperatures were required, or to heat the bedrooms of the nobility. Settlers also used pork fat, which was melted down and poured into special molds to make candles. This fat was so valuable that it was saved for the most essential purposes, such as lighting during feasts. These candles not only provided light, allowing people to go about their business after sunset, but also gave off a little heat and helped dry the air in the room, making it subjectively more comfortable. This was not just a matter of using resources, but of using them in a waste-free and multifunctional way, where every part of an animal or plant found a use. Nothing was wasted and everything was put to good use, which was a vital principle of survival. In winter, the diet changed dramatically, as access to fresh produce was limited. There were no fresh vegetables or fruits, so people ate what they could harvest and preserve from summer and autumn. Their diet consisted mainly of salted meat, fish, and dried vegetables, as well as grains and legumes that were stored throughout the winter. These foods were essential for survival, providing the body with the calories it needed. It wasn't just food to keep people alive, it was fuel for the body, without which people couldn't survive the winter, because keeping warm took a lot of energy. The medieval diet was very high in calories and fat, which was necessary to stay warm. Meat, fatty fish, pork fat, beans, and grains were the main sources of energy. Fatty soups and stews cooked over a slow fire were not only delicious, but also vital, as they provided the body with everything it needed. They helped the body generate heat and maintain body temperature in the constant cold. People ate a lot and often to keep from freezing and weakening. For example, they made thick bean soups with lard, which provided the body with the fats and proteins it needed to maintain its internal temperature. Smoked fish and meat, salted to the point of impossibility, were the basis of their diet, as they could be stored for a long time without refrigeration. These preservation methods, such as salting, smoking, and drying, were their only insurance against starvation. Alcohol also played a role in the winter diet. Beer and wine, diluted and undiluted, helped to warm up by dilating blood vessels and creating a feeling of warmth. They were not only drinks, but also additional sources of calories and energy that were so necessary for the body. In addition, they were often used for disinfection and as a remedy for colds, as alcohol was believed to kill germs. However, despite all these tricks, food supplies were not endless. What did they do when food supplies ran out and winter was just beginning? Want to know how they coped when food supplies ran out and winter was just beginning? The answer is coming soon. Clothing was not just a fashion statement, but a multi-layered survival system. It was a complex mechanism of protection from the environment, where each layer had its own specific purpose. It was not just a tribute to fashion, but a necessity dictated by the harsh conditions of life, and the right choice of clothing determined a person's health and even their very life. In an era when there was no central heating, clothing served as a personal mobile fortress, protecting against the bitter cold. Each item of clothing had a specific function, wicking away moisture or retaining heat. This complex system allowed the body temperature to be regulated, preventing overheating and hypothermia, which was especially important when performing heavy physical work. For example, the inner layer had to quickly absorb sweat, while the outer layer had to protect against wind and precipitation, preventing moisture from reaching the body. It was carefully designed to protect the body from constant cold and drafts. The clothing was designed to create air pockets between the layers, which served as a natural barrier. This approach minimized heat loss, even when the person was in a static position. It was the art of creating a microclimate that allowed people to work and live in harsh conditions. People learned to skillfully use available materials to create optimal temperature conditions, which allowed them to survive in conditions that seem unbearable to us today. To stay warm, people wore several layers of clothing. This principle was fundamental and was applied everywhere, from simple peasants to the nobility, as no one was immune to the cold. This technique created air pockets that served as a natural insulator, trapping body heat. These air cushions worked like a thermos, preventing precious heat from escaping while keeping the cold out. The inner layer, usually made of linen, helped wick moisture away from the body. Linen was lightweight and absorbed sweat well, preventing the body from becoming too cold. This was extremely important because if sweat remained on the skin, it would quickly cool down, leading to hypothermia. Constant work and physical exertion led to intense sweating, so choosing the right material for underwear was a matter of life and death. This was critically important, as wet clothing in the cold could quickly lead to hypothermia. Moisture freezing on the body rapidly lowered the temperature, and a person could quickly lose consciousness and die from hypothermia. The body would expend too much energy trying to keep warm. Such a waste of energy was an unaffordable luxury in conditions where food was a scarce resource and every calorie counted. The next layer, made of wool, retained heat. Thanks to its structure, consisting of many fibers, wool created air pockets that effectively trapped heat. It was the ideal choice for the second layer, which was responsible for the main heat retention. Even when wet, wool continued to retain heat. This unique property made it indispensable. Even in conditions of high humidity or light rain, woolen clothing continued to perform its basic function, making it an excellent material for harsh climates. The outer layer could be made of thick fabric or even leather to protect against wind and rain. Its main purpose was to be windproof and water repellent to keep the inner, heat-retaining layers dry. It served as a shield against external factors and helped keep the inner layers dry. This layer was usually the strongest and most durable, as it was the first to take the brunt of the weather. In addition, people wore thick stockings, gloves, and hats. These accessories were not just additions to the main costume, but vital elements of the outfit. The head and limbs were most vulnerable to the cold, and protecting them was a priority. These items of clothing were essential for protecting the limbs and head from frostbite. Frostbite of the fingers, nose, or ears was common and could lead to serious consequences, including amputation, which would render a person unfit for further work. Stockings were often made of thick wool, and gloves were made of leather or fur. Woolen stockings retained heat well, while leather or fur gloves protected the hands from wind, moisture, and mechanical damage. This combination of materials provided effective protection for the most vulnerable parts of the body. Clothes were bulky and uncomfortable, but they saved people from frostbite. Their weight and volume made movement difficult, slowing people down and restricting their movements. But this heaviness was a necessary price to pay for survival. Every step was difficult, but it was a necessary condition for survival. A person dressed in such layers of clothing resembled a clumsy bear, but it was this clumsiness that allowed them to survive the long, cold winters. On particularly cold nights, people slept in their clothes, wrapped in blankets and animal skins. Often, the only way to survive the bitter cold was not to undress before going to sleep. They used everything they could find to create a thermal cocoon around their bodies. This could be thick woolen blankets, sheep or bear skins, and even straw, which they laid under themselves for extra insulation. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was, to put it mildly, peculiar, differing greatly from our modern ideas of cleanliness. Modern standards and ideas about cleanliness were completely foreign to the people of that era, and what we consider a basic necessity today was then more of a luxury available to only a few. The lack of sewage systems and centralized water supply created serious problems, and people did not always understand how important cleanliness was for health and disease prevention. Castles did not have running water, and people had to carry water from wells or streams, which required enormous effort. It was hard and monotonous work that took a lot of time and energy, especially during the cold season. Every morning began with a trip to fetch water, and this was the responsibility not only of the servants, but also of the owners themselves if there were no servants. This hard work could take up to several hours a day, which took time away from other, more important activities. In winter, it was especially difficult because the water froze and access to it was limited. Sometimes it was necessary to break thick ice to get to the water or melt it over the hearth, which required a lot of fuel and time. This process was not only laborious but also dangerous, as the ice could be thick and the fire unpredictable and could lead to a fire. To avoid disease, people tried to maintain relative cleanliness as much as possible. This was more a matter of practicality than aesthetics, as they simply did not know about bacteria. They intuitively understood that dirt and unpleasant odors could be associated with disease and therefore tried to avoid them. For example, they tried to wash their hands before eating, but there was not always enough water to do this thoroughly, so they limited themselves to rinsing. In the bathhouse, people not only washed themselves, but also socialized and discussed the news, which made the process more than just hygienic. It was a place to relax and warm up, which was especially important in cold weather. But what did they do when the frost came and the water in the well froze? How did they cope when there was no fire, no water, and even drinking water was at risk? Keep watching to find out. They washed in large bathhouses where water was heated in huge boilers. These bathhouses were rare and usually located in cities or wealthy castles, and visiting them was a real event that people prepared for in advance. It was not just a process of cleansing, but a real event accompanied by socializing and relaxation. People gathered together not only to wash, but also to spend time in company, which was especially valuable in the isolation created by the winter weather. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a unique combination of folk knowledge, superstition, and herbalism. It was far from modern scientific approaches and was based on knowledge passed down from generation to generation, mixed with a deep belief in magic and the supernatural. It was a system where empirical experience coexisted with religious rites and mystical rituals, creating a unique but often effective approach to treatment. In general, the medicine of that time reflected the worldview of people for whom the world was full of invisible forces and spirits capable of both helping and harming. People of that time were convinced that diseases were caused not only by physical causes, but also by evil spirits or curses. They believed that illness could be the result of witchcraft, the wrath of the gods, or even moral transgressions. So healing required not only treatment of the body, but also of the soul. This deep conviction led to the frequent use of not only medicines, but also various rituals aimed at expelling evil forces, such as prayers, ceremonies, and incantations. That is why people turned to healers and shamans, who combined the use of herbs with the recitation of spells and incantations to enhance the effect. Healers and herbalists were true experts in their field, combining practical skills with deep spiritual and mystical practices. Their knowledge was passed down orally from teacher to student, and they were often the only people in the area who could be turned to for help. They believed that spells and incantations enhanced the effects of herbs, giving the treatment a sacred character. Often these incantations included invocations to higher powers, saints, or nature spirits, which made the healing process not just a medical procedure, but a religious and mystical act that instilled hope. The main means of treatment were herbs, which were collected in summer and dried for winter. This process required not only time, but also deep knowledge of the properties of plants, their proper harvesting and storage so that they did not lose their qualities. Each family had its own tried and tested recipes and stocks of dried herbs, which were considered a real treasure trove. These herbs were used to treat colds, wounds, and other ailments. For example, chamomile tea was used for inflammation, and St. John's wort infusion was used to heal wounds, which was very effective. In addition, Healers used plants such as plantain and coltsfoot, knowing their medicinal properties and methods of application. In addition to herbs, people used ointments made from animal fat and wax, which they made themselves. These ointments helped protect the skin from frostbite and chapping, which was especially important in harsh climates. They served as reliable protection against the harsh winter climate, creating a protective barrier on the skin that prevented cracks. These ointments were used not only as medicine, but also as a preventive measure to help keep the skin healthy, and their composition was simple but effective. Another important aspect of medieval medicine was the isolation of the sick. If a person fell ill with a serious disease, they were isolated from others so as not to infect the entire community. This practice was based not on scientific knowledge but on life experience, and it was the only way to contain the spread of infections. For example, if someone had smallpox or the plague, they were taken to a separate room or even outside the village to prevent the disease from spreading. Such measures were taken not only out of fear, but also to protect other members of the family and community, knowing that the illness of one person could lead to the death of many. In winter, when it was cold and dark outside, people spent a lot of time indoors, trying to keep warm and not get bored. The short days and long cold nights forced people to find activities that could be done in the warmth of their homes or castles. It was a time when the whole family gathered together, and every minute of such communication was filled with a special, deep meaning. Winter evenings became a time for strengthening family and community ties, when all members of the family, young and old, found something to do that they enjoyed. They did crafts, told stories, sang songs, and played simple but entertaining games. This was a way not only to brighten up the long evenings, but also to pass on knowledge and traditions from generation to generation, preserving cultural heritage. Storytelling was one of the main entertainments available to absolutely everyone. People told legends about heroes, fairy tales about magic, and myths about gods which were passed down orally. It was a way to keep spirits high and not go crazy from the monotony that often accompanied the winter months. Stories helped not only to entertain, but also to educate, instilling moral values and life lessons in children and adults alike. Through these stories, people passed on their culture, history, and worldview, preserving the memory of the past and shaping the future. Communication, collective creativity, and games helped people cope with the isolation that often accompanied winter. They shared news, discussed events, and simply enjoyed each other's company, which was vital in the harsh winter conditions when encounters with other people were rare. Music and dancing were an integral part of these winter celebrations. Lavish balls and feasts were held in the castles of wealthy lords, where minstrels and musicians were invited. But for most people, entertainment was simpler and more accessible, requiring no special expenses. Music and dancing brought people together, creating an atmosphere of joy and unity. Castles came alive to the sounds of lutes, flutes, and singers, while in simple villages, people sang folk songs accompanied by primitive instruments such as homemade drums or flutes. Such musical evenings helped to bring the community together and cope with the loneliness that could set in during the winter months when people were isolated from each other. Children were not idle either, but were actively engaged in their games. They played with toys made of wood or fabric, which they often made themselves. Rag dolls, wooden horses, and toy soldiers were the most popular toys. They made their own toys from whatever was at hand, such as branches and scraps of fabric, developing their imagination and fine motor skills. These toys were not only a source of joy, but also an important part of the growing up process, teaching children to craft and appreciate things made with their own hands. Adults did handicrafts, repaired tools, and wove baskets in preparation for the next season. Women sewed, spun wool, and embroidered, creating new clothes and decorating their homes. Men carved wood, repaired shoes, and fixed tools, which was vital for survival. These activities not only helped pass the time, but were also useful, as they allowed people to create things necessary for everyday life. This was especially important in conditions of limited resources. These activities were not just entertainment, but an important part of everyday life, allowing people to build up supplies and prepare for the next season. Animals in the Middle Ages were an integral part of life, their importance going far beyond mere existence. They did not just coexist alongside humans, but were the very foundation of their daily life, economic stability, and, most importantly, survival. Their presence was vital and absolutely necessary. Their role was multifaceted and comprehensive, covering virtually all areas of human activity, from providing food and clothing to generating heat in homes and serving as transportation. These creatures were not just pets, but an invaluable and multifunctional resource without which life in the harsh and unpredictable conditions of that era would have been completely impossible. Cows, pigs, chickens, sheep. Each of these animals was a source of vital resources such as food, materials for clothing, and even additional heat in the home. Animals were kept in barns, which were usually located in close proximity to living quarters, often even adjoining them wall to wall. This arrangement was not accidental. It was dictated by a practical and very important purpose that people had learned to use to their advantage. Their natural body heat helped to warm the living quarters a little, providing an additional, albeit small, source of heat during the cold, long winter months. This practice was widespread throughout Europe, as it saved precious fuels such as wood and coal, and generally created more comfortable and bearable living conditions. In addition, animals were the main source of products such as milk, meat, eggs, and wool, which were vital for the survival of every member of the community. Milk from cows and goats was actively used to make more durable and nutritious products such as cheese and butter, which could be stored for long periods of time. Meat and eggs provided essential protein and calories, which were critical for maintaining strength during hard physical labor. Sheep wool, which was sheared regularly, was used to make warm and durable clothing and blankets, protecting people from the bitter cold. The animals were fed hay, which was harvested in summer while the weather was good. This process required a lot of strength, endurance, and time, as the health and survival of all livestock during the cold winter depended directly on the quality and quantity of hay harvested. Haymaking was one of the main and most labor-intensive summer tasks, uniting the entire community and requiring joint efforts. In the Middle Ages, survival was essentially collective, as the chances of withstanding the forces of nature alone were minimal. A lone individual was defenseless against wild animals, hunger, and cold, so forming groups was critical for safety and sustenance. They understood that without the support of the community, no one could survive for long, as it was impossible for one person to build a reliable shelter, cultivate a field, or cope with the effects of floods or droughts. People understood that it was impossible to withstand the harsh and unpredictable conditions of the environment alone. So mutual aid, support, and solidarity were not just good manners, but the foundation of their existence. Mutual support became the backbone of their lives, binding families and entire villages together. For example, if a family was in trouble, neighbors would immediately come to their aid, offering food, shelter, and labor. They helped each other without hesitation, sharing their last meal in warmth. This generosity was not an act of charity, but a necessity, as they knew that tomorrow they themselves could find themselves in trouble and in need of the same help. People shared their resources freely, understanding that the common good was more important than personal gain, because in the event of a crop failure or epidemic, only by working together could they survive the hard times. This system of mutual support was not simply a manifestation of kindness or generosity, but a vital and well-thought-out necessity that ensured the survival of the entire group. Collective survival was a strategy that worked at all levels, from the family to the entire community, giving everyone a chance for the future. This strategy was based on a deep understanding that the strength of a community lies in its cohesion and unity in the face of common threats. People often slept together, gathering in one room to stay warm, and worked together to gather firewood for the winter and harvest crops. On cold winter nights, communal warmth was the only way to avoid freezing to death, and they shared beds to keep warm. Working together to gather firewood and harvest crops was much more efficient and faster than working individually, allowing them to prepare for winter and avoid starvation. This was not just socializing or friendly get-togethers. It was a well-thought-out and vital strategy that helped the community survive in harsh and dangerous conditions. The social structure of the time was based on the principles of mutual responsibility and dependence, where each member of the community played a specific role on which the well-being of all others depended. For example, when it came to gathering firewood, the entire village would come together to quickly and efficiently complete this difficult and laborious task before the frost set in. The men chopped down trees, the women and children gathered branches, and the elderly sorted the logs, with everyone doing their part to create a unified team. So survival in medieval castles was not an easy test, but a daily struggle for life. The people who lived at that time were resourceful, resilient, and incredibly hardy. They learned to make the most of the least, to use every resource to the last crumb, and to help each other. Their lives were marked by harsh realities, but at the same time, they were filled with simple joys, such as the warmth of the hearth, food, and communication with loved ones. They did not wait for a miracle. They created their own survival, relying only on their strength and knowledge. Their story is a story of how humanity survived in conditions that seem impossible to us today. What do you think about this part of history? What people or times would you like to learn about in the next issue? Subscribe so you don't miss it.